For those of you who do not know me, I'm Lorraine Lyon. I'm with the School of Nursing, and the other committee members are Doctors Dietrich, Kennedy, and Novak, who've all been very instrumental in helping Alvin with his dissertation. Alvin is currently a VA Quality Scholars Fellow, as well as a nursing performance measurement consultant for the Hospital Corporation of America. And prior to coming here to Vanderbilt, Alvin worked as an education specialist in the pediatric ICU at Cincinnati's Children's Hospital. While a doctoral student, Alvin has obtained funding for several pilot studies. He has 9 peer-reviewed journal articles, 7 as first author. He received the Dean's Writing Award in 2014 in acknowledgement of his accomplishments. He's also published 2 books for Sigma Theta Tau, for which he received the AJN Book of the Year Award. Alvin has presented his research at 7 national and international meetings, as well as at 5 regional presentations. So for today, Alvin will discuss some of his findings from his dissertation. He has 25 minutes, at which time we will open it up then for the audience for general questions. And at 11, we will ask the audience to leave, so that then for the next hour, Alvin will be doing his defense with just the committee members. So, Alvin, ready for you.
Thank you for that warm introduction. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
I remembered to turn the microphone on. So. Thank you all for attending. A special thanks to my family and my extended family and my non-nursing colleagues for being here on a very exciting day with tornadoes. So I'm very thankful that you guys can all be here. The title of my dissertation is Statistical Modeling Approaches and User-Centered Design for Nursing Decision Support Tools Predicting In-Hospital Cardiopulmonary Arrest. In addition to all the faculty who've guided my thinking and writing over the past 4 years, and my dissertation committee, to whom I'm forever indebted for your wisdom and patience, thank you. There are a few other groups that I would like to acknowledge on the screen. Without their support, this work would not have been possible, and I especially want to call out Dr. Sally Miller in the Simulation Center here at the School of Nursing for her support. As a little bit of background for today's topic of discussion, the last couple decades of healthcare have brought about increased use of electronic health records, or EHRs. As we collect more and more data from these EHRs, we are amassing these large data sets, and as the computational and analytical abilities are continuing to advance, we're moving into an era that some people are calling big data, and starting to think about what are the applications of big data? How can we gather information from our large amount of data, and what can we do with it? One application in which I'm particularly interested is predictive analytics, or the idea of taking a lot of information about a particular patient and predicting an outcome of interest, usually an adverse event. A lot of the work in this area has focused on accuracy. How accurate are their statistical models, and how well do they perform? There's another aspect, and I call that action. What are we asking clinicians or patients and families to do as a result of this new information? That's been far less studied. So I propose that as we move into this newer phenomenon of providing this novel information to people, that we would benefit from studying an outcome that occurs to a patient close in time to when we provide them this new information from predictive analytics. So the clinical context of the work that I'll be sharing today is cardiopulmonary arrest, or CPA, the idea of stopping a heart rate or not breathing, because it's something that if we give a clinician or patient family information about their risk of this particular event, it would be something where they may change their actions because it's happening so in the very near future. There have been very few studies performed in this area, but of those that have been performed, we know that simply adding some new technology to the clinical environment is not always beneficial. Of the studies that have been performed, and when I say predictive analytics, I'm talking about using 2 or 3 dozen or more variables, pulling them together through algorithms or models that provide a probability or a likelihood of a particular event, usually done in a way that would either be very challenging to do on hand, or it would be impossible. So in contrast to early warning scoring systems like Muse and Pews that you may be familiar with, that are just a few variables, I'm talking a lot of variables we're pulling here in real time. The studies in this space have primarily just provided clinicians with the information, not measured treatment fidelity. Did clinicians do something different with the information that was provided to them? Some of them have automatically initiated interventions, like a rapid response team to intervene for the patient, and they have only included patient characteristics like lab values, vital signs, maybe patient assessments. I believe that predictive analytics could easily be the next major addition to our clinicians' toolkits. We've used past medical history, we've used current patient assessments, but we haven't done as much about predicting into the future about what could happen to a patient. In the broader realm of clinical decision support, there have been far more physician-focused studies than nursing-focused studies, even though in our healthcare workplace, nurses outnumber physicians by about 3 to 1. So I think there's a gap here of how we can use this information to improve nurses' practice. We also know that humans don't necessarily prefer to think probabilistically, so it's wonderful if we can provide a statistical number, but we don't naturally like thinking in statistics. And furthermore, nurses have been shown in several studies that they tend to use an intuitive decision-making style where they match patterns and look for trends and changes in those trends. They use that style of decision-making more than the analytical inference comparing different options head-to-head. And specifically to information displays in the informatics literature, we know that nurses prefer trends while physicians prefer a different sort of information display focused on inference. So given this background, and as a little bit more background, I did some preliminary work during my coursework. We have to do a research practicum. And so I conducted a study with the help of a few of my committee members in looking at the current information gathering behaviors of nurses, because I felt that if we're going to introduce a new tool, if we can understand where nurses currently go for information, where they currently look for data elements, then and we can map that out, then we could introduce our new technology, our innovative tool, into the places and times that makes most sense for them. So you've probably already read the purpose of the study, but we wanted to map out that environment. We used qualitative description. We had 10 bedside nurses and 8 charge nurses, and we conducted individual interviews and focus groups. And I'll talk a little bit in a second about why we had different types of nurses involved. We moved through 3 phases of data collection. We first asked them about their current information gathering behaviors around cardiopulmonary arrest or a patient on whom they called a rapid response team. We also directly asked them about their definitions of risk-related terms like probability and risk and uncertainty. And then this was the fun part, we provided them with weather scenarios. So in qualitative research, you shouldn't ask participants to give you information on what they think they would do in a situation that they've never experienced. So we couldn't directly ask them, how might you use this prediction model tool, because we would probably elicit an acquiescence bias. So instead, we provided them with a scenario that did contain probabilities, which would be the chance of rain or the chance of a storm on a day like today. So we provided them with different scenarios and asked them to tell us whether or not they would plan an outdoor event based on the scenario that we gave them. Whether that was a picnic or a wedding, just what went into their information gathering behaviors on deciding whether or not to hold an outdoor event. The particular screenshot I've displayed up here was a particularly helpful scenario in which there are 2 different sources of the chance of precipitation for the same location, and they show 2 different patterns where one is a little more stable and then one drops off from 100% all the way down to 15%. That was a very helpful scenario, that discrepancy in showing how they go about gathering information. So we combined both what they told us about their patient experiences and then their outdoor event planning experiences, and we're able to map out their information sources into what we'll briefly just say they gather information from patients, from other people, and technology. Our major themes were gathered from both their patient experiences as well as the weather scenarios, and we found 3 themes. One, that they attempt to find information from additional sources during uncertainty. So maybe in the weather scenario, that was either a discrepancy or it wasn't, it was cloudy, but the chance of rain was low, so they would go and look at a radar and want to see the motion of the incoming weather or not. Some nurses said they always were prepared for the worst case scenario regardless, so the chance of precipitation might be 0%, but by golly, it's Nashville and I'm going to take an umbrella with me anyway. Similarly, in a clinical setting, you may think that the patient is low risk, but you're still making sure you have emergency equipment available. And then there was a desire to review more detailed predictions, so always wanting an hourly view or the map as opposed to a daily summary. Regarding the perceptions of the words probability, risk, and uncertainty, participants were very inconsistent in the use of those words, and that may have implications for how we roll out tools that are probability-based. I had two formal aims in my actual dissertation. The first was statistically focused. We compared the performance of logistic regression and survival analysis, which are statistical regression strategies. We compared those against random forest, random survival forest, which are more machine learning, and we looked at their development and validation at predicting cardiopulmonary arrest. Unfortunately, 25 minutes is not enough to cover both of these aims today. I do have a few slides at the end regarding this aim that I'd be happy to discuss with you at the end, but it was a very fun aim. It was very quantitative, and we did learn a lot about regression versus machine learning, as well as classification of whether or not an event occurs, and can we predict when it might occur within a hospitalization. The focus for today, though, will be what is probably most close to the clinical environment in touching, and that was our aim was to describe the similarities and differences of information preferences among bedside charge rapid response team nurses during the design of a tool that would predict cardiopulmonary arrest. My conceptual framework was informed by, you'll see a little bit of Donabedian structure, process, outcome moving left to right for the health services researchers in the room, but more largely informed by Carrion's SEEPS model, Brokel's clinical decision support expert rules, which is an nursing informatics framework about how we take data and move it into a decision support tool. And you'll see a little bit of Venkatesh's unified theory of the acceptance and use of technology. Where I want to bring your focus is to the darker shaded boxes. So aim one was what scientific or mathematical evidence-based information are we putting into our statistical models and how are we processing them? And then the second aim, again, is the focus of today, or what are the characteristics of the technology and the clinician that could influence the output of this particular tool. So the method that we used is participatory design. It is a qualitative approach. I'll talk a little bit more about it on the next slide. We went in with some hypotheses. We had predicted or hypothesized that the preferred design elements for this novel tool, this predictive analytics tool, would vary based on the type of role. So just as nurses and physicians have different decision-making styles, which I believe is due to their context and the nature of their work, of the tasks that they perform, similarly, we have different roles of nurses, and maybe one size doesn't fit all. So bedside nurses see a few patients over a prolonged period of time, versus charge nurses have a little bit less detailed overview, but over many patients that they may spot check with. And then rapid response team nurses, in the context of this particular outcome, just swoop in and only see a patient for about 20 to 30 minutes, and that's all the information that they have time to collect. So we hypothesized there might be some differences based on this particular role. The goal of this aim was to identify those design elements that are important in a tool that's probability-based, and then develop a prototype. And we wanted to do this in a context that mimics the intended context and task of the tool. So we recruited participants from the Vanderbilt Adult Hospital, the Pediatric Hospital, as well as the VA Hospital. We did this via email and word of mouth. We ended up with 6 bedside nurses, 8 charge nurses. These were all from outside the ICU, outside the emergency department, those nurses that would call a rapid response team. And then we also asked rapid response team nurses from the ICU to attend. So we ended up with 20 participants from 14 different units, and they received a $75 gift card for their participation. The setting for our study, because I said I wanted to do this in a context that mimics the context and task of actual work, was in our simulation center here in the School of Nursing. For those less familiar, I'll have a few more pictures on the next slide. The simulation center includes high and low fidelity mannequins and specially trained personnel to operate those mannequins, and it mimics a hospital unit, so you can see that they're all lined up in hospital beds there. There's some curtains in between, there's places to document. There's even an individual patient room, and inside that individual room you can see there was a vital signs monitor, IV pumps, and so it really was the closest we could get to the clinical environment without being in a real clinical environment, because I don't think the patients would have liked us drawing with colored pencils and designing a tool in their hospital room. So for those not familiar with participatory design, I want to share a little bit about the method. There are 3 activities that comprise a session or a workshop. The first is priming, and then we move into designing, and then a debriefing activity. In the priming activity, we try to help participants understand the task and the context of what we're going to ask them to do in the next activities. It prepares them to be active contributors. So what we did is we took our participants, we placed them in a conference room close to the simulation center. Some of the people in the video are in this room. Thank you guys for my colleagues that helped create this video. We modified a video from the Agency for Healthcare Research Quality. It was an 8-minute video that we ended up producing. It's about a patient who experiences clinical deterioration and they end up calling a rapid response team. There are some communication challenges in the video. It's part of a training curriculum with AHRQ focused on communication, and we felt that would really help put our participants in the mindset of a real clinical environment, not only seeing a patient deteriorate, but all the challenges that come along with being in the real environment. So after the video, we did a brief discussion, and participants provided us with some of their observations and additional insights. In the next activity, we kind of the core of the method is where everyone's active. All the participants are co-creating a design. And by participants, I'm talking about not only the people that we recruited and paid, but the researchers as well. Similar to community-based participatory research, if you're familiar with that method, researchers and the participants are all researchers. They're all participants. They're co-creating something, and that's what we were focusing on here. So we moved to the simulation lab. We had bedside nurses caring for the mannequins, and we would introduce a few little nuances, complaining of pain or the kid taking off his nasal cannula, again, to mimic the real world. Charge nurses were a little bit more removed, but where they could see the whole unit, but they were in a group together. They had less information about the patients. And then rapid response team nurses remained in the conference room until about halfway through the design activity. The patient who was in the video in the priming activity, we mimicked in the high fidelity simulator and had the mannequin begin to deteriorate about halfway through. And so we asked the bedside nurses and charge nurses to activate the rapid response team and have them come over. We used, like I had mentioned, paper, colored pencils, scissors, ruler. The mannequins are allergic to markers, so that's why we stuck with colored pencils. Sticky notes, and we had, so there was work happening with the patients, but that wasn't the full focus. It was really how do we create a tool that could house this model. And in the last activity, participants described their experience and they reflected on others' experiences. So after a brief break, we moved back to the conference room. We discussed what participants had created, what their preferred design elements were, and used a semi-structured open-ended interview guide to facilitate that. There were 3 activities in each session, but then we did the session 3 times with different participants in each session. Each session lasted about 2 hours. We took notes during the priming and designing activities, but the debriefing session, the last 30 minutes, we audio recorded the discussion. We took pictures of the artifacts and then took notes as well. For analysis, which was really occurring all along the way, even starting in the debriefing session, participants were helping us conduct some of the analysis. But formally, we applied theme-based content analysis, ongoing aggregation of results. We discussed, we deliberated on both the comments that end users made as well as the artifacts that they produced. We then met with human-computer interaction and design experts to evaluate our prototype, and we took the prototype back to participants as a form of member checking. In qualitative research, we talk about the themes that resulted or surfaced from the analysis. I'd rather call these goals as it relates to technology. That was I'll use those interchangeably, but there were 3 primary goals of the technology. They wanted it to communicate patient status. It needed to paint a picture, a big picture of the patient. They also wanted it to promote autonomy or empower the nurses or provide for advocacy. So nurses may have a gut feeling that something is wrong with a patient, but this tool could provide an objective reinforcement of their gut feeling that would help them communicate with the prescribing providers. And then it had to be consistent with the context. It had to make sense. If I didn't feel that the patient was going to deteriorate and the prediction model told me they would, how do we reconcile that? Will I trust it? And so the more that I could trust it, the more that it made sense, the better the tool would be. I want to read one quote that I particularly like as it relates more to goal number 1, but I like this was one of the participants. I like the idea that you could see the trending vital signs during that rapid response call, like we started here and this is where we're going, so you can easily see at a glance. Have things go up or down. We mentioned seeing the interventions, like a little tab where you tap, look, IV fluids given, and who did an EKG. timing to go with it, so you can see where it goes, all that's trending. That way, anybody that walks into the room, they can easily see what's going on without asking a bunch of questions, repeating the story every time. So we had quite the task ahead of us. I tried to increase the contrast of these photos. You won't be able to see them, but you can get the idea that we were sketching a lot. We were drawing graphs as these patients were deteriorating. You know, what information would you need? What would you like to see? Probably the prototype that is a little easier to see, this was at the end of the first workshop, where in the debriefing session I started sketching as I was listening to participants talk, and you can see we started to create maybe a mobile phone and application-based prototype that shows the trends over time and getting the ideas of what they were hoping for. So this is why I say analysis really started right from the first workshop. So to show the timeline of how we came up with the prototype that I'll share in a second is we had these 3 workshops that all built on each other. And in fact, in workshops 2 and 3, we asked participants in those, so once they had shared information with us, we shared with them information from previous workshops to have them react to it. Kind of encourage convergence of ideas if possible. We definitely didn't force that, but we said, here's what a previous group came up with. What are your thoughts? And then we drafted some prototypes and we met with designers and experts. It moved from paper-based to application-based at this point. And then we had an application-based prototype that we shared with participants as a form of member checking. So rather than continuing to talk, I would love to show you what we came up with in an interactive way, if it will let me. I love technology talks where you're going to show technology because they always fail. So you can see this on my website, quantitativenurse.com/prototypes, if you want to check it out yourself and give me more feedback. But we chose different initial views based on role, whereas charge nurses and rapid response team nurses might want a bigger overview. Bedside nurses just want to see their patients. I'm going to start with this charge nurse overview. You can see you could choose different outcomes as we begin to develop the tool with more, but you see your unit, and then the patients are listed in decreasing order of risk. And so you could flip through this, see any individual patient you want, but on a quick glance, rather than a lot of things that are organized by room number, this is by risk. And so I'm going to click on this high-risk patient. You get some basic information here at the top, but what was really exciting was this curve here. So this would be the prediction model, and you can see a previous probability as well as what we expect the patient's probability might be within the next 24 hours. And we thought this was pretty, but this was definitely not sufficient for what the participants wanted. So what we have added on here was the ability to select filters or layers that show what is contributing to this probability. Because yes, it's one thing that the patient is at risk, but what's contributing to that? So I'm just selecting heart rate, hematocrit, and white blood cell count here, and you can see that the trends of those particular values are overlapped. And so the heart rate's going up, the hematocrit's coming down, the white count is coming up, and you can click on these and get additional detail. And so the scale on the y-axis is just specific to what you have active at that point. But this was really what they needed to tell that story or paint that picture of the patient. And then finally, what we've added are treatments. And so they were really curious, you know, it's one thing if a patient is getting sicker and you haven't done anything about it, you could start intervening. If you are intervening and they're still getting sicker, that's a different story. So the ability to see what's been done, so for example, fluid boluses or antibiotics started. And we can come back to this if needed. All right, there were some other recommendations that the participants had made that didn't fit within the prototype, but that we have documented and want to keep in mind as we move forward and make a more robust prototype. Things like voice activation, live video streaming once you activate the rapid response team so you could begin interacting with the team in real time. Certainty or confidence intervals around the scores, maybe some summary text paragraphs, kind of the opposite of natural language processing where here's a summary of the patient. Some of these will be a big task, but we definitely wanted to document them and have a record of them. And then they brought up several barriers that we want to keep in mind. If wireless connectivity goes down, what about patient privacy? Always a big deal in the informatics space. And what about loss of critical thinking? Are people going to rely on the tool more than their own critical thinking? And then, as I had mentioned previously, those discrepancies between what I see and what the subjective tool tells me. So in conclusion, and to begin to wrap up, we found that participatory design was valuable as a first step in developing tools that support rather than interrupt nurses' cognitive workflows. Contrary to some previous work that I mentioned in the background, the inference support, hypothesis generation may be requested by all participant roles, even bedside nurses who we had hypothesized would really want more of an intuitive decision-making style. Strengths of our study are that the simulated setting mimicked the clinical environment. We were able to represent multiple nursing roles, and this was a process of iterative design with end users, researchers, and human-computer interaction experts. Our limitations, we only used 3 hospitals and 2 health systems. Someone had commented that should be a strength, but I think there could be some geographic differences that we'll keep in mind, and we should continue to look in other settings. And we were unable to determine if the tool could go as far as changing behavior. So that sets me up for the next steps that I hope to see. I plan to build a more robust prototype and do formal usability testing and test the ability to influence behavior and action in a simulated setting. I want to include bedside and charge nurses from ICU and emergency department settings. They were only included as rapid response team nurses here, and see if they require unique design elements and preferences. We heard the terms baseline, context, and sick a lot, and there's not a whole lot of literature on what those might mean to people or how we can influence perceptions of those. So we would maybe like to unpack that a little bit more in some qualitative work. I want to develop prediction models with operational data, including nursing documentation behaviors. So patient characteristics have primarily have been what's used, and I'd be interested if you start charting more frequently, is that a predictor of this particular outcome, looking at nurses and physicians' documentation patterns. And then finally, as we move to clinical trials, so if we have a prototype that we've got some usability testing behind, to pilot it on a single unit as a feasibility trial, and then move to single center cluster randomized trials. I'm particularly a fan of stepped wedge designs that allow continued iterative changes over time, and is a very robust study design where you're worried about contamination of treatment effect in a particular unit. So with that, and 22 seconds left in my 25-minute timer, I say thank you and would like to open it up for questions.
Thank you.
Dr. Kristenberry.
Alvin, thank you for an excellent presentation. And I'm so impressed with I'm impressed with a lot of things, but I'm really impressed with the commitment that your participants seem to have to this study. Can you talk a little bit about how you recruited the participants and maybe how you held that commitment?
It's a great question. And in fact, a couple of the participants from my preliminary work, the qualitative studies, came back from my participatory design sessions, which was well over a year later, and they had made comments saying, we're very excited about this work and we want to see it moving forward. So I particularly found them in the children's hospital, and I don't know if it's because I have a background in pediatrics that they felt comfortable with that, or if there's a different culture over there. I have heard from one of the engineers here at Vanderbilt that he says the children's hospital is a really great place to recruit because they're very excited about research. So I think culture of the environment and the commitment to research could be an important factor of that. We also learned in the first study that simply sending out emails and going to staff meetings was probably not the best way to recruit. And we had some suggestions from the first study that we send, I forget the name of the newsletter. There's a nursing-specific newsletter at Vanderbilt Medical Center. And so I got approval from IRB and from the education department to recruit via that particular medium. And that was very helpful in soliciting a lot of interest since it went out to all of the nurses. And then I think another key element would probably be when we drafted the recruitment email, we used the Frist Nursing Informatics Center here at Vanderbilt to give me access to photos that they had, and they designed, I gave them the content and said, here's my vision, and they ran with that and really created a visually appealing recruitment flyer that was technology and patient focused, and I think I would assume that helped with recruitment. And so if I stay at Vanderbilt, I think I have a little cadre of participants that may keep coming back, which would be wonderful. So did that answer your question? Thank you. Yeah?
As a follow-up to that, can you speak to the pros and cons of having more focus group site sessions versus the individual interviews to gather information?
So more focus groups versus individual interviews? Yeah, so in the preliminary work, our intention was to do individual interviews with bedside nurses and then do the focus group with charge nurses. We chose that strategy because we felt that, and so for charge nurses, the specific questions we asked them, thank you for this question because I get to elaborate a little more on those 2 slides. The question we had for bedside nurses was, where did you go for information related to anticipating that a patient would begin to deteriorate? For charge nurses, the questions were more focused on how do you go about gathering information to make assignments. So charge nurses assign nurses to patients. How do you go about gathering information to make assignments for patients that you think might be deteriorating? And having served briefly as a charge nurse myself, I knew that could be a fairly complex task to try to speak about. So we used the focus group method for this complex task because we felt that when charge nurses in the group hear other people's ideas, they might be more likely to come up with, oh, hey, yeah, I did do that, or no, I do this differently, I forgot to mention that. And in fact, before the focus group, we asked the charge nurse participants to fill out a worksheet while they were making assignments and said, where did you go for information, what's a redundant task, what's a useless task. We asked them to bring those worksheets completed to the focus group as a starting point and as a way to jog their memory. Versus individual interviews, you're telling us about a patient experience, and if they deteriorated or coded, they probably stand out. So our assumption was that it wouldn't be as challenging to bring out information. Thank you. Yes, Dr. Stoldorf.
I'd like to ask you if you have found that to the analysis on the individual interviews versus the focus group interviews, did you find very differences in the analysis, in like how you analyze it, difficulty of that? Did you find it more challenging? And for someone like me who's going to do focus group interviews, what would be your advice in that from your experience?
I'm humbled that you would ask for my advice, Dr. Stoldorf. So because the questions differed slightly, so there were a few sets of questions, it was easy to code differently individual interviews for bedside nurses and then the charge nurse focus groups because there was a different set of questions that was asked them. So I think those were a little bit easier to code, but then we asked them the same questions about weather scenarios and the perceptions of risk and uncertainty and probability. Perhaps because charge nurses were previously bedside nurses, or here at Vanderbilt, actually many of them serve in both roles. Some of them have a dual administration and charge nurse role, and then others have this charge nurse role 1 day a week, bedside nurse 2 days a week. That regarding the weather scenarios and the perceptions of risk-related terms, we didn't end up coding them differently, or we didn't find that if you grouped them out, like did the charge nurses tend to say something different than bedside nurses? I didn't find that to be the case. We used a qualitative analysis software called Deduce was the particular company we used, and we attached descriptors to the transcript. So we were able to identify them based on years of experience and education and age and then what role they were playing, charge, bedside, or something in between. And we were able to group out the analysis based on those so we could filter by what did this group say and this group say. It would be interesting to go back and take another look at that if you have a particular hypothesis, but nothing stood out to us on differences in the analysis there. Thank you. Dr. Ivory.
Since there seems to be a lull in raised hands about this aim, can I shift for a second to your aim 1? Because that's what informed your predictive model, correct?
Yes.
So can you just briefly describe the challenges that you experienced using big data analytics for a nursing predictive model?
The challenges.
Yeah.
So this will take us to 11 o'clock? No. No, that's an excellent question. My eyes were opened, and the dissertation and the PhD were definitely a learning experience, and that is one of the manuscripts I actually hope to get out of this work, a methods-focused manuscript on the challenges. So one of the challenges, for example, you go to the research, the synthetic derivative database people who de-identify our medical records here at Vanderbilt and make them available for research. And I said, I'm interested in the nursing collected variables. And they said, who? The nurses? I said, yes. We don't pull in any nursing documentation. And I thought, wow, the clinicians that spend more time with patients than anyone else in a hospital are the nurses. And even the vital signs, we found one of our biggest hiccups was that vital signs were missing in about 60% of hospitalized patients, which is not I mean, these vitals are being measured on patients. They're just not making it into the research database. And so they said, no, we don't pull nursing documentation, so this came from elsewhere. So I think making sure that you know what your data sources are that lead to the research derivative, the research databases. We did a simulation study to overcome some of the missing data challenges. And then I think probably a bigger challenge will be repeated measures. So moving forward, and that's something we're dealing with in the field right now, that hospitalized patients have repeated sodium values or repeated heart rate values. We ended up just going with the first available value on admission. And in fact, if we couldn't tell what the first value was, we marked it as missing so that we could keep it as clean as possible. And so how we handle these repeated values would be really important, and I'm interested in looking at that going forward. Yeah, thank you. Yes, Dr. Wells.
So, really, really nice presentation.
Thank you.
And yeah, so I'm just dying to know, did you come up with whether it was easier to use logistic regression or a machine learning model?
What a great question. And I did not plant that question. So I had several graphs available just in case. So these are, you may have seen sensitivity and specificity, or ROC curves. One of the challenges, so they're commonly reported in the literature, but when we're looking at rare events, and so nationally there are only a couple 100,000 cardiopulmonary arrests a year, patients that experience cardiopulmonary arrest a year. And in our sample of the data, we had about a 0.6% event rate. So only 0.6% of our patients experience this event. So AUCs can be very difficult to interpret and in fact look overly optimistic. So what we have on here is a recall precision curve instead. So recall is your sensitivity, and then precision on the y-axis is a positive predictive value. And so you want to see these curves continue to shift to similar to an AUC, taking up a greater and greater area on the curve. So they did okay in performance. The worst performing is let's see, do I have a is this green curve here. This is our random survival forest. And then the best performing, based on a metric that is actually the harmonic mean of both recall and precision, was this blue curve, the random forest here. But pretty close to that was the black curve, which is the logistic, and then the Cox proportional hazards model was below that. So the survival curves performed a little bit less than the classification curves, and the machine learning within that space performed better than the traditional statistical regression. So on one aspect, the accuracy was higher with the random forest over the logistic regression. However, what I would like to point out, I was prepared, friends. So the same colors here. So this is a fictitious patient that I said, let's pretend we have this model. Let's pretend we have this fictitious sick patient. Now what we have is their hospital day and their probability of a cardiopulmonary arrest. The logistic and Cox models are down here, so the traditional statistical strategies, kind of showing more or less a flat line. And this is a sick patient, like a glucose of 300 and a white count of 40, and I picked a very, potassium of 5.5, but just as many crazy values as I could come up with. What I think would be the best to induce action would be this random survival forest here. So even though it had the lowest accuracy, to me, if I saw this, and I'm an intuitive thinker as a nurse, this patient is getting sick. As the hospital length of stay goes on, their chance of a cardiopulmonary arrest is increasing a whole lot. The drawback of the random forest, even though its accuracy is higher, is that it's just a flat line. That's all you can get is a flat line unless you begin to work on these repeated measures differently. So on an accuracy side, the random forest did better than the logistic. And on the, I called it interpretability, I thought the least accurate model may be the most likely to induce behavior. So it depends is the short answer. Thank you for that. I'm glad I got to showcase some of the statistical work. Dr. Bain.
Very nice job, Alvin.
Thank you.
I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about why you decided to use the participatory design as opposed to other usability designs that are available. Why did you decide that particular one?
That's a good question, and we talked about this a lot. I'm also prepared with a slide for that, I think, yes. I have a lot of slides, folks. This is a busy slide, and so I didn't want to put it into the formal presentation, but to walk you through just a little bit, these are different methods regarding usability-related concepts, design research concepts. As you move toward the bottom of the graph, they're more research-led, and toward the top of the graph are design-led, so you can see the borders up there. And on the left side of the graph are methods that are more an expert mindset, and on the right are more participatory mindset, more of the co-creation. And so you can see participatory design is very participatory in nature, very co-creating the designs, and it has both a design-led approach and a research-led approach. As opposed to usability testing, it is a user-centered design, but it's much more expert mindset. And so when we were embarking on shoring up the aims and developing the methods, we thought usability testing and kind of what it gets a lot of attention would be great if we already had a product that we thought we could just modify based on feedback. But we got to a point where, given all of the background, the humans not thinking probabilistically, the intuitive decision-making style, but trying to put in a statistical probability, we don't have really anything to, there's a few things maybe we could start with, but we felt the development of the current designs was too early to jump to usability testing. Usability testing in that sense will be better once we have a product in hand. So for example, future steps, when I make this prototype more robust and we put it into a simulation lab, we could start to do A/B testing. Do these elements in the design versus these elements in the design make more sense for actually inducing action of clinicians? And so that would be more on the usability testing side. You can continue to iterate from it, but we didn't feel like we had a product worthy of usability testing at that point yet. Thank you. Yes?
I think your design, as you describe it, makes absolute perfect sense. But chances are the people working with you have never participated in participatory design. So what kind of feedback did you get from them on that process?
That's a great question. This is new. This was a new method to me as I embarked on the dissertation, and so we didn't formally assess how we could do it better, but we got several cues along the way of things that weren't working. For example, so one of the things that was really helpful was larger groups. So we divided the participants into bedside nurses, charge nurses, rapid response team nurses. Due to a few last-minute cancellations in our very first workshop, we only had one participant in the bedside nurse category. So I joined up with her so that, which is very intimidating. The person doing all the talking is now working with me, but it was really challenging for one person by themselves, because I'm trying to stay as unbiased as possible, but get feedback and that's not the typical work of nurses. And so I think being in a group was one thing that was helpful. The other thing that we did is we had screenshots available of previously published, somewhat related designs. I may have some of these available. You guys are like, of course you do. I may not. Oh yeah, here we go. So, man, this is wonderful. Are you taking notes, Dr. Mayon? I was prepared. So, in the qualifying exam of the PhD, you do an exhaustive literature search, and so I had pulled and seen all of these designs before, and so I went back and took screenshots from the articles and just anything that could remotely relate to a patient's risk of a particular event or showing trends over time, including Vanderbilt-looking screenshots and things that I've developed in some work with Dr. Maxwell. They needed a starting point somewhere, and this was really helpful. It was challenging to say, okay, create something. Well, revising is much easier than creating in any aspect of life. And so what we found some participants ended up doing, because they were struggling so much, is they took the sheets of paper that we had printed out with these things on them, and they took notes. I like this aspect, or you know what, this is for families. I wouldn't feel comfortable sharing that with families, or you know, this is too cluttered, or I don't know what these lines are, and all that became helpful feedback of don't do this, or you know, they would say, oh, I like that the medications are up here, and so that was helpful. And so when I say we took photographs of things, these were some of the things that we scanned in, and we coded all their handwritten notes from the data on these. And so that was really helpful for those groups that were struggling, to give them a starting point. And then the final thing would just be continuing to reiterate questions from our semi-structured guide when we weren't getting responses from participants. You know, what additional information would you want is not always the way that people are used to being asked a question. So we might rephrase of, you know, what do you want to see right now? What would be helpful? What's missing in what your current understanding of this patient is? So, did that answer the?
It did, thank you.
Dr. Ivory.
What are you thinking about, you were talking a little bit about next steps and, you know, in some clinical trials, that sort of some randomized trials as far as evaluating these tools. What are you thinking about in terms of control groups and trying to get at that decision making that happens in the absence of predictive analytics and decision support, and trying to assess the differences between those very technology-driven methods versus classic intuition and nursing care?
That's a good question. So as far, and I think there might have been a couple questions in there, so let me see if I can think through this. So for the control group side, you know, one of the challenges, and this was one of the manuscripts I published in the coursework about these methodological challenges of studying these sorts of decision support tools, is that many times they randomize patients and then implement a decision support tool. But the problem is that our intervention is actually at the clinician level, not the patient level. So randomizing patients sets you up for contamination of treatment effect. You know, I'm a nurse, and I have, you know, maybe 3 patients, and in 3 of the patients, or I have 6 patients, 3 of the patients I have a probability score, and 3 patients I don't. But I'm going to know if this patient over here is sicker than this, but even though I don't have a probability score, I may still think they're sick. So I think one of the ways of looking at this is doing cluster randomized trials at the unit level, right? So, you know, Unit 6 South will be an intervention group, and Unit 6 North will be a control group. Now, ideally, those control groups are as similar as possible, but without overlap of nurses moving from one to the other. As it relates to, maybe I heard an implementation question in there. This is, you know, as we're moving our workflow from being intuitive to putting in an analytical spin to our work. One of the things I like about the stepped wedge design is that rather than taking, for example, 10 units and randomizing, you know, 5 to the control and 5 to the intervention group, you randomize the order of introduction of the intervention. And so you start with 1 unit and you roll it out, and you can see, you know, what worked about that implementation, what didn't work about the implementation. So not just the tool, but how we rolled it out, how we educated nurses, where we put it, when we had it display. You can change that. You still keep the first unit in the experimental group, and then you add the next unit. Eventually, everyone gets the intervention throughout the whole organization, so you have the benefit of doing the randomization and comparing experimental control groups. You have the benefit of iterative design changes and iterative treatment rollout changes. And then from an administrative perspective, you also have the benefit that every unit eventually gets the technology that sounds cool and promising. So I think that's one reason I really like that design, is I think it overcomes several challenges. Now, these are big studies. They can be challenging to get buy-in, to make sure administration is okay with randomizing rollout over time, and they can be expensive, but they overcome a lot of the research design challenges. Did I answer all the questions in there? What's missing?
Let me tell you why I asked, and I asked related to a project that I worked on looking at the anticipatory care team model over at the medical center a few years ago. And one of the things that we did was some really anecdotal discussions with staff nurses about their perception of risk. And they, to a single one, would say, oh yeah, I can tell you, and this was risk of readmission, I can tell you who's going to come back. I can tell you who's going to be readmitted.
Oh, right.
But I can't, I can't really affect that from, from a care perspective, from a an intervention perspective. So that was
Okay.
one of the reasons why I was asking. The other thing that you mentioned that I think might be really interesting is to look at some of those documentation patterns in non-implementation units versus the actions based on your app or the model for patients who actually did have an arrest, and maybe perhaps measure your control groups that way.
I like that. Yes, you were describing what I hope my program of research goes. I think those are great questions. Yeah, from the, so there has been one study on readmission rates comparing physician perceptions of readmission rates to actual, and found that sometimes physicians, and there's nothing against physicians, I'm sure nurses would be the same way, but they actually perform worse than pure guessing on their AUC curves. And so we want to appreciate that there's a belief that I can predict, but balance that with enriching that with objective criteria. And then as far as what we do about it, I've primarily been focused on recognition of a problem and less on what we do about it. I'm hoping for a career development award to begin looking at that more fully, studying decision analysis, decision theory, and seeing if we can model or compare costs and utilities of different treatment options. Most of this is what's my baseline risk and has nothing to do with, okay, once we intervene and give fluid and start oxygen, what happens to the risk? And I would love to explore that. And then potentially even with some and I know those can involve some Bayesian methods and Markov models, but looking at Bayesian analyses in the sense of what is my clinician's perception of the patient's risk and how does that fit in to enriching the objective tool? Because there's a little bit of data that shows in the imaging informatics research that clinicians can make errors and computers can make errors, but when you do them both side by side, the error rate drops to a new low. The accuracy gets much better when they're together. Dr. Ridner.
You got some of this in answering Dr. Ivory's question, but my question is, let's take the event that you are using in your scenario, which is the pulmonary arrest. And we're now talking about randomized clinical trials, control group, et cetera. What outcomes would you want to follow in those trials to determine the value of predictive analytics, particularly for that specific event? And do you think those outcomes might differ across those three groups that you included in the information to go into the design of the product?
That's a good question. We included cardiopulmonary arrest. In some ways, that was a limitation of our data and what we had available. A lot of the people in this space are doing a composite outcome of in-hospital mortality, unexpected ICU admission, and cardiopulmonary arrest, and they group them together. It increases the power because there's more events. So I think that's possible to look at. I think the beauty of this outcome initially, and I'm fairly outcome agnostic, I'm really interested in how we can influence clinical decision making. The beauty of this outcome is that if you tell me the patient's high risk, I may do something in the next 12 hours. Hopefully it's easy to study. For future outcomes, what I'm hoping is that what we learn from this proximal outcome will apply to pressure ulcers, falls, readmission rates, any adverse event, infections, nosocomial infections, ventilator-associated events. I think I'm hoping that the same decision-making style insights that we gain looking at this outcome will apply to the others, and I think there'll be, once we start adding more outcomes, we will have to think about information overload. We're already in an information overload, but how do we display multiple events at the same time? I think I'm missing something in what you're asking, though.
What I'm asking is, what's the take-home benefit to the patient and to the nurses of using this type of analytical model in real clinical practice?
Yeah.
I'm just pushing you to kind of
Yeah.
get in touch with the nursing a little bit.
Yes, which is fun to bounce back and forth between the two. As I've thought about what we'd have people do, and especially as we move to an era of shared decision making involving patients and families, so one option for a patient at high risk is to call a rapid response team and send them to the ICU. But I think there's a lesser outcome of just increased monitoring, but I think there's another outcome that maybe this is Grandpa. He's 102 years old, and he, has cancer, and his risk of experiencing this event in the next 12 hours is 98%. Should we consider, making sure we have do not resuscitate orders or advanced directives, or is this someone that we will want to code? I think that's a part I'm really interested in exploring. I think it would align well with nursing work, especially as we move as Niners moving toward focusing on palliative care and symptoms, and as nurses, it's not everything. Not every patient deserves to go to needs to go to the ICU and be separated more from family and be in a very sterile environment. So I think those are other options we could look at for this particular outcome. Yes, Dr. Unerdal.
So one of the major problems in implementing predictive decision or predictive models in practice is the sort of trust in the model. How do you establish trust with nurses, with physicians, with other care team members, and patients as well, that the model is accurate and it makes sense. I was wondering if you had, in your interviews or in the participatory design, if you kind of talked at all about that piece of trust in models and how to get to that place.
That's a great question. I think it probably surfaced a little bit in the theme of consistency with context is where we raised that up to of, is it going to make sense? One of the things I think we heard was if the model is wrong early on, whether it's wrong in the right way or wrong in the highway or in the low, in the opposite, that could quickly ruin the clinician's trust where they may never trust it again. Some groups are running things in the background as they roll out models, and then they'll show them to clinicians and saying, where do we want to put our cutoff point? And in fact, that's one of the things that we did to set up for that work of just looking at, depending on where we set a threshold, how many patients are we talking about identifying here? But I think it might require, I'm really passionate in having a foot in a clinical world and a foot in a biostatistical, biomedical informatics foot to try to bridge the gap between the language of those two groups. And I think it may require clinicians thinking about probabilities a little bit differently, where sometimes we create models that are the confidence intervals about the population, and how do we look at maybe certainty and or confidence interval for a particular patient, which may be more in line with Bayesian statistics. And so maybe if we can get the informatics and biostatistics community to think about how do we provide or express uncertainty for the population or the individual that is of interest to the clinician. If I can help facilitate that discussion, I think that would be a sweet spot I would love to be. But I do worry that if you have a patient that codes that was a low risk, they'll distrust the model, and then vice versa. And it's one of my fears. So starting small, maybe again the sept wedge design. Let's see what works and what made sense. But I don't know that I have the answer to that. But I would love to explore that in the future with you if you're interested.
I do think that's one of the problems that models will be wrong some of the time.
Yep.
There's no perfect model.
Yeah.
So getting past that.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful that if we do more of a Bayesian approach with they're not called confidence intervals, the probability distribution, that expresses the uncertainty around the point estimate, that maybe that is a more natural way of saying, this is where the most density, it's probably around 90%, but it's still possible that this patient won't arrest, especially as we begin intervening. I don't know if that's a more natural way that makes sense with the way that we think as humans, but yeah.
You mentioned that your team of volunteer nurses are very enthusiastic to provide feedback. How representative do you think that is of the population that's mentioned would be using these tools?
That's a great question. I'm sure we have a selection bias of, the people that are going to sign up and participate in a study are probably those that are at least on the early end of the diffusion of innovation curve. We did find, so in the first study that I did, we offered them a $30 gift card for participation, and it was very challenging to recruit. $75 was a much better sweet spot, so we got a lot more interest. And so hopefully we captured a few people that weren't participating to advance, well, they were participating to advance science, but that wasn't their whole attitude. I'm sure we got some people that thought, I like technology, this is gonna be fun, I'm gonna sign up for it. Although I would also say nurses are really good about talking about all the ways that something could fail, and which is really great in design workshops to document those. So I would say we probably have a good idea of all of the things that could go wrong based on what they expressed. And actually, one thing that was really insightful, I think a lot of people said this model will be great for everyone else except me. Yeah, I mean, they didn't add that except me, but that's essentially what they were saying was, this will be really great for new nurses. It'll be great for, all these other people that aren't as, intuitive or situationally aware as I am. So one of the things we have as a thought moving forward, Dr. Novak and I have spoken about this. It was an insight in one of our debriefing sessions of what if our outcome that we predict is not 24 hours away or 12 hours away, it's on the next shift. And so then it takes away any ownership that maybe, well, this model is telling me how to do my job and I don't agree. And it becomes more of a, the next nurse coming on may end up with a really challenging patient. Maybe, I'm gonna help them out, right? I'm gonna put some things in motion to help them out. And that may be a balance in how we don't insult people's intelligence, because I think that focus on are people going to lose critical thinking and who really needs this model were big issues. And I'm sure we'll see even more of that as we begin to roll it out. Thank you for that question.
We have time for one last question. Well,
Thank you.
everyone.